Welcome to Globus Books virtual salon. Globus Books is an independent bookstore in San Francisco. We've been around for 50 years, and we have this YouTube channel where we feature all kind of literary and cultural shows. We focus mainly on the post-Soviet space, Russian, Russophone literature, but we also bring everything interesting that is happening in San Francisco Bay Area and in the world. So today we are really excited to bring to you Alla Efimova, who will be talking to Jonathon Keats. Alla Efimova, PhD, is the author of this new book, Thought Experiments, The Art of Jonathon Keats. She is a PhD and a contemporary art curator and museum specialist with a background in critical theory. She is the founder and principal of Kunstworks, a consulting firm that addresses the growing need for legacy planning among artists of the post-war generation. As the former director and chief curator of the Magnus at the University of California, Berkeley, one of the largest museum collections of Jewish art in history, Efimova engaged cutting-edge scholars as guest curators and collaborators and commissioned important regional and international artists to create site-specific projects, including 2 works by Jonathon Keats. She also co-published 2 of his artist books together with Modernism Inc., Yod the Inhuman and Zion the Profane. Efimova is an author of several books and catalogs and has taught at the University of California, Berkeley, Santa Cruz, and Irvine, as well as San Francisco Art Institute. I would like to add that we do carry Alla Efimova's books at Globus, Textura, check it out. And I'm happy to introduce Jonathon Keats, who is an experimental philosopher, artist, and writer. His conceptually driven interdisciplinary art projects have been hosted by institutions ranging from the Los Angeles County Museum of Art to Arizona State University to UNESCO. Keats is the author of 6 books, most recently You Belong to the Universe, Buckminster Fuller and the Future, published by Oxford University Press. He is currently a Polar Lab artist at the Anchorage Museum and an artist in residence at the SETI Institute, UC San Francisco's Memory and Aging Center, and UC Berkeley's I hope I pronounced it correctly, Creekfield Station. His art is represented by Modernism Gallery in San Francisco. And I also want to add that Jonathon Keats had a couple of books published in Russian and 1 in Russian only. And he's going to tell us more about it himself. Please stop by Globus Books, subscribe to our channel. My name is Irina Zabriskie. I'm an author of 5 books, 3 short story collections and a novel, and I host and produce the shows for Globus Books. Welcome, and I'm excited to pass the microphone on to Alla Efimova. Alla, thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Zarina. It's really a pleasure to see so many friends and to be hosted by you and Globus, which has become really quite a force under your leadership, sort of Russian-speaking cultural world and beyond. So I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to Jonathon on your channel. We have some Russian connections, obviously. I was trained as a historian of Russian art, and Jonathon, as Zarina mentioned, has some kind of unlikely Russian connections as well in terms of publishing in the Russian language. But I think what I'd say is that Jonathon is an artist of the absurd. And as we know, absurdity and the absurd is such an important part of sort of contemporary Russian art and contemporary Russian literature. And I think maybe it's this has really drawn me to his work more than anything else for the last almost 20 years. I would also like to add that we're, I think, both thankful to Julie Decker, who, the director of the Alaska Art Museum, who co-edited this volume and is really kind of responsible for bringing this book into being. And to Sibylla Savage, the amazing art photographer in Oakland, who worked remotely with us during the pandemic to make sure that the objects, the artifacts, are photographed in a way that make them, look like real art. That they have the gravitas of art. The book, we don't have it in our hands yet. It's supposed to be released any day, and Zarina can probably tell us at the end of the program how to pre-order the book on the Globus's website. It's published by Hirmer Publishers and distributed by the University of Chicago Press. So I met Jonathon nearly 20 years ago when I started as a curator of the Magnus, the Jewish Museum in Berkeley. And I immediately started a series of exhibitions called Revisions, where I invited contemporary artists to kind of reimagine a very sort of old archival collection of Jewish art and culture. And Jonathon was one of the artists I sort of immediately asked to create an exhibition. And why don't we talk about our first collaboration, which was called the Extraterrestrial Art Exposition. Jonathon, do you want to briefly tell us what it was?
Certainly. It was a little while ago, but really has remained central, I think, in so many ways to my way of thinking and working, which come out of philosophy, but often manifest within the art world in objects and sometimes in imagery that some might define as art. I initially developed the idea back in, what was it, around 2006 or 2005? It may have been even earlier, that's right. There had recently been a signal detected by the Arecibo radio telescope that nobody could explain. And so there was some speculation that it might be extraterrestrial communication. And then this was quite rapidly dismissed by the scientists who said, well, it isn't scientific. It isn't showing anything that mathematically seems very interesting. And my response was, why would it be interesting if you could identify what it was, if you already knew the math? And maybe it isn't math at all. And so, if I were an intelligent being elsewhere in the universe, I don't think that I would send pages out of my algebra book. I think that what I would send would be something truly universal and profound, which would be art. So I took the signal and tried to figure out, algorithmically speaking, what sort of artwork might potentially be encoded in it. And that was the genesis of the first intergalactic art exposition, where I didn't insist because, first of all, I don't know whether there are intelligent beings elsewhere in the universe. And secondly, I don't know whether this signal was sent by them. But certainly, there was no way that I could say that it was going to be visually manifest in one way or another, because I knew nothing about the beings, if there were any, who were sending it. So I created several different versions, and that was the basis of our exhibition, which then, to reciprocate on what may have been the most generous intergalactic loan of all time, I then created some artwork, abstract work, to send out into the universe, and not knowing whether what was sent our way was abstract, because I just don't know what life is like wherever these beings might have been from, if in fact it was sent by beings elsewhere in the universe. I wanted to create something that was abstract and yet also was grounded in our culture in one way or another. And so that's where the invitation from Alla made perfect sense, because it was an invitation to go through a collection that was extremely rich in terms of artwork, but also in terms of heritage. And so I took material out of the museum archive as a basis for then abstracting and then setting up a slinky antenna on the lawn of the old Magnus Museum and using CB radio rig to encode it and send it out into the universe. And thus far, there have not been any art critics from anywhere else in the universe who have responded.
So interestingly, as you know, as I just showed on the slide, that green circle painting was sort of the abstraction that Jonathon came up with, which was a Giclea print on a large canvas. And it looked uncannily like Kenneth Noland painting. For instance, Turnsole, which is, I'll show you in a second, which is at the Museum of Modern Art. So what Jonathon was saying is that, you know, abstract art is our way of communicating across not just understanding each other, but communicating across the universe. But this real kind of the fact that he drew on the history of modern art, and there was sort of absurdity and some, I guess, there's some sense of satire in this work, was sort of important. And then there were artifacts that were produced as part of this project. There were, you know, there was a little book, there was there were those paintings, and then we collaborated on the next project called Atheon a couple of years later, and there were some artifacts that were produced as part of it, and I was completely drawn to the sense of the absurd, and I was drawn to the way in which these projects were embedded in the history of modern and contemporary art. But the projects were not getting any traction in the art world. They were not, although Jonathon was represented by a wonderful gallery in San Francisco, it seems like the art critics were not really picking up on the work, although the projects were getting so much coverage everywhere else, right? In general interest magazines and sort of popular magazines, because editors were sort of picking up on this sort of the irony and absurdity, and the large questions that were embedded in this project. So anyway, the years went by, and Jonathon kept producing project after project, asking this really interesting questions, sort of drawing on, again, on sort of the history of kind of being in dialogue with artists of previous generations and some of his contemporaries. And 10 years later, there was a whole collection and archive of this projects, and we started talking about a book probably 10 years ago. And my conviction was, well, this is art, and this needs to be treated in the context of our contemporary art history. Whatever this, you know, whatever the genre is, we'll have to define it. But I was convinced that we needed to have a monograph, and we needed to treat Jonathon as an artist. So that was the genesis of the book, and then life intervened, and there was an opportunity a year and a half ago to actually produce this monograph, which is called Thought Experiments, The Art of Jonathon Keats. And it's co-published by the Alaska Art Museum. So it's in the context of art. And it has really wonderful art photography. Thought experiments. Jonathon, do you want to tell us what you mean by that, and why is it the title of the book, and what are thought experiments?
Well, I never intended to make art. I never intended to enter into the art world. I studied philosophy in school and found it to be exhilarating and also deeply frustrating. Exhilarating because big ideas have always been what have drawn me, and a general curiosity, but dismaying for the fact that in academic philosophy, it was a really limited conversation in terms of, first of all, what you could talk about, secondly, how you could do so, and thirdly, with whom you were going to have that conversation. And having some sort of a Socrates complex, perhaps, or some delusion that philosophy could or should or needed to be somehow present in the world at large, I ultimately escaped academia and tried to find ways in which to do philosophy on my own terms. And the art world simply is the most inviting place to be able to operate, because anything goes, because nobody is quite sure what art is anymore. And there's been an incredibly liberating phenomenon that is, I guess, in some ways, something that can be traced back to Marcel Duchamp and perhaps even earlier than that, the Dada movement, certainly the absurdism that you find in some early Soviet art as well. I think this is relevant to consider in terms of how art becomes anything and everything. And so I wanted to take advantage of that opportunity and to make use of what I had learned in academia as a set of tools, potentially, to be able to explore big ideas with everybody. So by entering into the art world with tools smuggled out of academia, out of academic philosophy, the idea was to be able to do philosophy in public. Another part of philosophy that I really did not care for, which I didn't mention a moment ago, but which is really relevant here, is that philosophy in academia seemed to be about the answers. And I was interested in the questions. I was interested in ways in which we could ask more profound questions. And the thought experiment in philosophy ostensibly serves that purpose, but really does not. Experiments are meant to be investigative, but the thought experiment in philosophy, generally speaking, is used as a mode of argumentation, where you take a counterfactual and you use it as a way in which to demonstrate the position that you have set out to persuade everybody of from the outset. I wanted to take this literally and to say we could do experiments that were thought experiments, that we would explore ideas by setting up counterfactuals in the world, entering into them together, and then seeing what happened as a result. And absurdity, of course, is an ideal state to be in order to suspend disbelief, in order to have all assumptions put into limbo. And so the thought experiment for me has become a methodology, very broadly speaking, for taking a possible world or a counterfactual, a situation that might, by virtue of what we explore and what we discover within, might shed some light on the world in which we live, who we are, and what we want to make of this world, that this could be a way in which to do so collectively. The laboratory is open to everybody.
So in the book, among sort of essays by some other writers, I collected 20 of these projects, 20 thought experiments, and it's sort of an archive and an interpretation of going from 2001 to almost, the 2021. So why don't we talk about your first one, the 24-hour cogito? And I have, and can you walk us through what the thought experiment was in that case?
So my very first project, I don't think was a thought experiment in the sense that they have subsequently become, because I hadn't yet really formulated my work in that way. I was at that stage really just trying to figure out how to think in public and how to bring people into this process to make thinking, in the sense that that thinking is a practice in philosophy, into a more public practice. And I was also very interested in the history of art, and remain very interested, and very much so in conceptual art as potentially a realm in which to be able to do philosophy in public. And this project really was, I think, the most directly related, at least in terms of where I came into it and what I was trying to achieve, the most directly related to art history, trying to find a place within art history. So I simply spent 24 hours thinking, and the thoughts were the artwork. I did so rigorously in the sense that I had a factory time clock set up, and I would punch in and think a thought. When I had thought it, I would then punch out and punch in and continue this process, where I set up the gallery, which was a gallery called Refusalon that was south of Market. I set up the gallery as my studio, and in the distance in that photograph on the right, you can see a model posing nude. So that contextualized this as a space in which to make art. But the art that I was making was the thought itself. And the thoughts were available for sale to anyone who wanted to buy them, where they would reveal their annual income to the dealer and then pay minute for minute whatever it was that they were being paid based on whatever it was that they did. And they would get the punched factory time card as a receipt. They would never know what the thought was, because I wasn't recording the thoughts, and because all that I could ever give them anyway would be a representation of the thought, not the thought in its own right. But the factory time card gave a materiality to the to what is fundamentally inaccessible, the thought itself. And I think that what I was interested in was trying to explore the elusiveness of thought, and yet what came out of it was a broad range of interpretations, many of which were far afield of what I thought I was doing. For instance, people interpreted this as being about labor and value. And everything that anybody said to me seemed much more interesting than anything that I had thought. I mean, during those 24 hours or in general. So to me, this was, I think, generative in the sense that it made me realize how a project can become something beyond what I set out to do, and can be generative of ideas. And that then, I think, is where I came to recognize the thought experiment as a general methodology for, in this case, I had thought of this as a found process, in the same way that we have a tradition in art of found objects, that I could take a process and I could misuse it in a way that could be used for some other purpose. So punching on a factory time clock and punching out, used as a means by which to differentiate and to sell thought. But then I realized that there was something else that was happening, and that I could discover through this process, creating this this alternate reality, I could discover things with other people. And so that then led to everything that's happened subsequently.
So why don't we move to like the last project, which was the impetus for this book, well, the Alaska River Time Project. It also has to do with time and recording time, but in a very different way 20 years later, right? Um, and so this was a project that you undertook in Alaska and that was shown, or what would you say it was? I guess it was shown at the Alaska Art Museum.
As everybody probably has already guessed, I am very interested in time, somewhat obsessed with time as a subject. And as I've thought about time, I've come to recognize the ways in which time has been the mechanism by which society has come to the place where we are today. That timekeeping and the technical means by which we have done so have allowed for, in many ways, the process of industrialization, as well as the current economic construct and the ecological catastrophe that has come about as a result of that situation economically, as well as the underlying industrial causes. And so my most recent project, which is ongoing, which is initially being shown, as you can see in this image, at the Anchorage Museum, but where it will ultimately be global, is to look at other ways in which we might reckon time. How do we get away from technical time, which allows, because of the abstraction, allows us to act with impunity without any sort of notice of what impact we're having on the planet? How could time instead be construed as a ground truth, as some emergent phenomenon of the world in which we live? And so, as so often is the case for me, I started with a cliche. And the cliche in this case was that time flows, and of course, rivers do as well. So the idea that I started with was to say that we could take a river and allow the river to tell us what time it was. So notionally, you might imagine putting a water wheel into a river where the water wheel is calibrated to spin 1 revolution per minute based on the current flow of that river. And then build clockwork that gives you the hours, the date, and even could provide an annual indication. And then to stand back and to allow the clock to run, where, first of all, it will be erratic by our standards because seasonal changes are going to make it variable in terms of the flow of the river. Also because weather is inherently chaotic, but also there's going to be a long-term impact in terms of climate change and the melting of the glaciers in this case, that what happens as a result of going on to fluvial time is that there are multiple levels of engagement with the environment that become possible and even become inevitable. That by building a clock, and we did not use clockwork, it would not have worked for the winter in Alaska, to say the least. We instead have been using US Geological Survey gauging stations to build a digital clock, which you can see projected onto the Anchorage Museum facade in this case. But the idea is that the clock becomes an observatory. It becomes a way in which we're able to observe the fluctuations and also the aggregate change in the environment through the observation of time. In the contingency, in the moment, we don't know what time it is unless we're constantly vigilant, and that builds a new relationship with the environment. But simultaneously, there is the fact that we're able to see time getting ahead of us, perhaps, or getting behind us. So there's potentially a feedback mechanism that can be built into society as a result of being able to try to bring ourselves into a sort of dynamic homeostasis where time is not accelerating or decelerating, but somehow where we are able to stabilize it through our actions.
In this collection of sampling of 20 projects, we include documentation of events, the documentation of various prototypes, right? The various artifacts that were generated as sort of part of this experiment, and which and also each project is accompanied by the original press release. And I have to say that one of the really distinguishing feature of Jonathan's sort of projects is the fact that he creates a kind of a microcosm, a very insular space where he is really the, what would you call, a Renaissance man or the do-it-yourself man, but he generates the text of the press release, which is also serves as a kind of a manifesto for the project. He designs the prototypes. He documents the work. He performs, if there are some events, in quotation marks, performs at this event, because sometimes he poses as a film director, sometimes he's a producer, sometimes he's the banker, or whatever the role that he puts himself in to create this project. And he generates the media coverage for this project, so it becomes a kind of a total sort of artwork, each of this project. So what I feel like over the years my role has been is to sort of break into that tightly created, almost like theatrical sort of stage space that Jonathon creates, and to try to kind of pull out of it, and not only to demonstrate how the projects work on a continuum, how they relate to each other, but also how they are in dialogue with other artists, and how they fit into a trajectory of performance art, conceptual art, sometimes installation art. So each of the, as I mentioned, each project is accompanied by this original text, by a press release. And for the book, we created mostly new photography for the objects that Jonathon creates. I'm going to maybe show a couple of them. So for instance, this is a photograph from one of the performances, and as you could see, he uses certain kinds of props, such as an antique fountain pen. There is a bell, a desk bell, and those sort of now have been sort of monumentalized and photographed as sort of part of this sort of meta performance that Jonathon is engaged in. I wrote an introduction to this 20 projects. We have this sort of archive, and there is an interview that Julie Decker and I took with is a conversation, kind of recorded conversation with Jonathon. But there are other writers in the book who take kind of different approaches to Jonathon's work. And Jonathon, could you just mention a couple of the other essays?
Certainly. It really has been fascinating to me to have the work interpreted by others. And I use the word work in the broadest sense of the word, not knowing, again, whether it is art, nor necessarily really wanting to know. And from my standpoint, not seeing what Allah sees from the outside as being performances or props, not seeing those in those terms myself. I stand inside every project as the cheapest labor available to be able to instantiate that world. And I also stand outside of it as an experimental philosopher trying to understand the world by these means. But I don't take this world as necessarily being a fiction or necessarily being real. I leave that open. And part of what has been really interesting about this book as a project has been to have Allah's expert perspective as an art historian, but also to have other points of view, including Bruce Sterling, who, as a science fiction writer, looks at the work within that context, which is one that I never set out to do something that was equivalent in any way to science fiction, but I recognize the world building quality that there are commonalities. And there also are essays by Edward Tenner, who's an historian of technology, who draws connections between my work and a number of projects and a number of approaches that come out of the history of technology, including those of Buckminster Fuller, who I've written about. There also is an essay by Michael John Gorman, who founded the Science Gallery Network and currently runs Biotopia, which is the Natural History Museum in Munich, who's able to take a perspective from art and science, but also with a deep interest in and knowledge about biology. And then Ariane Cook, who was the founder of Arts at CERN, so the Large Hadron Collider. There was an art program, there still is an art program there. She founded that. So to take the perspective of art in relation to physics. And while I don't see my work as being necessarily in the domain of art and technology or art and science, I'm very interested in the sciences and technology because they are so core to our civilization. And I'm interested in everything. So therefore, I have no choice. I'm led to that in order to be able to understand everything. And in a sense, each of these is a key to doing so. And each of these people provides a different key to the work where I don't necessarily agree or disagree with anyone. And happily, people don't necessarily seem to agree with each other. So I must be doing something right if we're all confused.
The book, sort of like a thought experiment, it's not available yet, but it will be. So you can make your own experiment and visit our website at globusbooks.com, and you will find the book available there. And as soon as it materializes, we will ship that to you. We don't know yet when that will happen, but we certainly will let you know. And this was truly fascinating. As someone who's been interested in time for most of my life, I was like completely taken away and blown away by the whole description of just two experiments. So I'm really looking forward to reading the book and finding more. Maybe Alla, you can give us, or maybe Jonathan, you can decide who can do that. Give us another experiment and or just a feel of what other experiments the reader will find in the book.
One of my favorites, I would say, is, and I have some images for that, called the Bureau of Standards.
While it is really not the case that every one of my projects is time obsessed and that every project starts with time, this is another project that does so. I was thinking about the metric system and how here in the US just never been popular. When they put up signs on the highways with kilometers per hour, people get out their BB guns. So I was trying to figure out what we could do to bring the metric system to the people. And I realized that people are really very interested in themselves. So perhaps if I were to customize the metric system, that could be a way in which to finally bring about the revolution that had happened more than a century ago in Europe. And so the metric system is built on time. It wasn't initially. It was initially built on a measurement of the planet and then proportionally creating a system that would allow for all kinds of measure of length, mass, and so forth, all to be interrelated mathematically. But ultimately, in order to have a truly precise measurement of time that, or a measurement rather of distance that could be used anywhere, it was based on time, the distance traveled by light in a given fraction of a second. So instead of a second as ordinarily defined by most anyone but me, I guess, I decided to define the second on the basis of a heartbeat, which actually there is a tradition in science experiments. For instance, Galileo used his heartbeat. Many scientists back in the day, so to speak, used heartbeat. But of course, everybody's heartbeat is a little bit different, even when you take heartbeat at rest.
So
So
was the
what I did was I created a system by measuring people's pulse to calculate the distance traveled by light in a fraction of that heartbeat, and then mathematically generated a conversion table that allows for you not only to know your personal meter, but also your personal liter, kilogram, joule, every measurement that you can think of, all of them tie to the meter. And therefore, by taking your heartbeat, I was able to truly customize a metric system for everyone.
So in the book, look at Marcel Duchamp's 3 standard stoppages as the antecedent to this project. And I'll just maybe quote from the text. So, the undermining of the rational basis for commonly accepted standards has a venerable tradition in conceptual art. The most direct precedent to Keats's project is Marcel Duchamp's 3 standard stoppages. In 1913, Duchamp dropped 3 threads, each 1 meter long, from the height of 1 meter onto 3 stretched canvases. The threads were then adhered to the canvases to preserve the random curves they assumed upon landing. The canvases were cut along the threads profiles, providing a template of their curves, creating new units of measure that retain the length of the meter, but bear the imprint of the artist's hand gesture. It's a joke about the meter, Duchamp said about the piece. If a straight horizontal thread, 1 meter long, falls from a height of 1 meter onto a horizontal plane, twisting as it pleases, it creates a new image of the unit of length.
Wow, this is brilliant. I love it. It's you know, the category of objective, the most objective becoming the most subjective. And do you have more on that, or like objective versus subjective in your thought experiment?
Other project?
Yeah. Oh, not this particular one, but in general.
I think that every project on some level really pertains to the relationship that we have in terms of our understanding of the world and the world as it is in its unknowability. So perhaps at that very abstract level, yes, that's definitely in play. I think that a lot of the projects that have involved reaching out into the unknown have particularly involved this area of investigation, broadly speaking. So the first intergalactic art exposition, and on the other hand, the most recent work that we include in the book, Intergalactic Onophonics, which is an effort to find some sort of means by which to relate all of us, and by all of us I mean any being anywhere in the universe, with anyone else through music, which ostensibly is a universal form of communication. So by creating musical instruments that are not necessarily ones that we are directly able to experience in terms of the music that they make, such as instruments that actuate gravitational waves instead of sound, that this becomes a way in which all of us can interact musically. You might imagine having a jam session where no individual might have direct access in this, in a sensory way, to what any other being is actuating, but that all of us can come together in our differences while maintaining those differences and respecting them in a way that has a common purpose. So if it can work for the entire universe, then, you know, why not across the US-Mexican border? Why not in our own midst? And I think that I'm always in projects trying to figure out who we are and how we think, but also trying to engage the present moment and to provide heuristics, or to find methods, to find provocations even, that might in some way engage some of the challenges that we face.
Hi, Jonathan and Alla. Really interesting talk. My question is really about the way you um, I don't know, you redid three standard stoppages and put Martin Muller's name in twice. That was quite interesting. I realized that he's the owner director of modernism. So I was just interested to hear you talk a little bit about that, and how you sort of chose to create the piece that way.
So while there is absolutely an art historical precedent that can be brought up in terms of how you might frame that work, how you might think about it or talk about it, and while Duchamp is certainly relevant, I did not set out to recreate three standard stoppages. I genuinely wanted to address the metric system and the ideas of standardization and universality that are embedded in it, which I believe, and I think Alla through her quote has elucidated, was common. It was a common origin, the origin of three standard stoppages and the project that I undertook. It was only subsequently, I think, that while I certainly knew that work, that any sort of connection in any explicit way came into sort of a dialogue. The dialogue was generated between the two works. I customized the metric system for anybody who chose to provide their heartbeat. And I opened a Bureau of Standards at Modernism Gallery as a space in which to do so. And Martin Muller is the owner of modernism. And so he was one of the people whose pulse I took, and then I created a standard meter for him. There's only one that was made for him, though. I don't know whether Alla can pull up the picture again. I think that what was photographed, there's one of his. We also have one that is Ed Ruscha, and I think that one of them was Craig Newmark. So yes, we have, yes, so Martin, Craig, and Ed are the three people. So as you cannot see, because somehow they've gotten cropped so that you can't see the end that is, I guess, there we go. So as you can see, each person has a standard meter of a different length.
It was
And
just an illusion. it looked like it
Ah,
was
yes.
remarkable price.
Oh, ever. Okay.
Thank
That
you.
said, I think that it would be interesting to consider having a whole set of personal meters that are taken, your personal meter while jogging, your personal meter while watching television, your personal meter while sleeping, and to have a stack of them that you could pull out the one that's appropriate based on whatever activity you were undertaking. So we have a new project in the making.
Somebody asked this question is for Jonathon. Does seeing the work all together in the book give you additional ideas to pursue, or in this case, speaking on the show gives additional ideas to pursue?
Absolutely. I first of all, I set myself the task because I called these thought experiments, and we titled the book Thought Experiments. I wanted to be true to what I think is really remarkable about the history of experimentation, which is one where no given experiment is authoritative, that it is only one in a series of experiments, often where different hypotheses are pursued or different parameters, different variations are taken on a given protocol. And in order to encourage that, because I've never seen these works as being my own in any sense, I said earlier that I'm the cheapest available labor, and I really believe that. I mean, I definitely believe that I'm the cheapest available labor, but I believe that also I am not in any way in possession of these ideas any more than anyone else is. I simply am trying to set up the parameters and to run an experiment. But I want others to do so as well. I want others to do so in other ways, exploring these ideas. And in order to try to encourage that, I tried to step back and for each one of these 20 to come up with a variation, another way in which a central idea that was animating the thought experiment might be explored. And for the most part, they have not been attempted and are invitations for others to take them up. Though at some point, for want of originality, I might end up doing so myself. I do think that also there has been a lot of pattern recognition, inevitably. And some of this is a sort of apophenia in the same way that we see patterns in the stars and give them the names of constellations. I think that there are many patterns that I've seen in my work that certainly were not there as a matter of intention, but may not even be there and might only be within my own head. But that can be generative in its own right, can be a means by which to move forward creatively. I think there's also a great risk in seeing too much of what you have done before and seeing it in any way that makes it so that it becomes too much of a system and that it therefore becomes a matter of a basis for repetition or for trivial variation. So what I hope that I've gained from this has been misreading of my own work through very good readings by other people. But because those readings are all at odds with each other, that it might lead me to misunderstanding myself in some new and interesting ways.
That is a great answer. And we have a next question for you. And that's continuing on Terry's question about Duchamp, or his piece with the meters. How would you describe your work's relationship to Dada and Fluxes and those artists' sense of the absurd? And do you think of yourself as primarily a performance artist?
Mm.
I don't think of myself as an artist. I don't object. And I certainly don't think of myself as a performance artist. And I, again, don't object to it. I have great admiration for art. I have great admiration for performance art. And I think that from my standpoint, by being the interloper and by hijacking the mechanisms, by basically at some parasitic level, perhaps, being able to operate within the art world. I'm able to do things that I might not be able to do otherwise. But I don't see, I don't set out to make work in any sort of direct dialogue with the history of art, nor do I seek to have my work venerated as, appreciated as, or denigrated as art, because the art context is just that. It is a context for operation, and sometimes is a context against which I'm able to undertake a thought experiment, for instance, to take music or to take painting as the basis of some of these intergalactic projects, where there's a very direct way in which I am taking art and operating on some of the assumptions of art in order to be able to then investigate them. But still, even there, I think that there's a meta level at which I'm engaging art. I don't feel like I'm in it. I feel like I am I am using it as a way in which to take up ideas. I think that Dada and Fluxes, they both fascinate me, and I've spent a lot of time studying and writing about them. And part of what I do when I'm not making mischief in this particular way is that I write art criticism. I have a weekly art criticism column on Forbes.com, and I see that as being really a great opportunity as well to engage in cultural dialogue, and often will write about Dada and about Fluxus. I think that there have been great discoveries in each of those, and also in many other movements, of how to activate people within society in terms of thinking in ways that they might otherwise not. But I don't think that art has a monopoly on that. And I certainly don't see myself as, well, I don't really want to be monopolized by it, I guess.
So it partially, this is sort of my fault in systematizing this project in a particular way from my perspective, and drawing all these connections to the history of Fluxes and Dada and conceptual art. But this is not the only way to contain them. It's one way of contextualizing.
And I wouldn't say fault. I think that that is the benefit of your having taken up all of this work, is that you can find a way through it. And I think that's really important to me, for people to find their own ways through it and to leave traces of the ways that they have found through it. And a book is a great way to do that. And ideally, it doesn't become the master text for understanding the work. Ideally, I don't start to believe you in terms of what you've said, but the fact that it is there, I think, adds to the work outside of myself.
Yeah, I would chime in that I wouldn't blame you, Alla, for drawing these parallels, because I wasn't familiar with any of this work. And my first associations, of course, Duchamp, but also Marina Abramovich and even Yoko Ono, or even I studied a lot of performance artists, resistance art of the modern Russian art collectives. They are similar in a way that they use objects as metaphor to change your thinking. With a unmythifying, sort of like in Barthes sense. So that probably just one aspect of your work. Of course, I haven't seen enough to say, but the initial association is certainly there. And I think it probably boils down to the definition of art, which we might not be able to give in the framework of this particular show, but what is art versus philosophy? And they all originate back, if you take shamanism, it all goes back to the one root. So this is something to talk about in the future, perhaps. But meanwhile, there's a related question from our audience on YouTube. Kim Ano asks Jonathon, how do you know when something is enough or art or enough science?
I don't. think that I have an instinct for when an idea, I think I have an instinct for when a premise that starts out as a notion, a what if, becomes too big for me and therefore needs to be out in the world where I can explore it with others. I don't start in any given domain as far as asking what if, but I'm a relatively quick study when I have to be and will research and learn the science or figure out the technology or research the religious theory or look into the economics or whatever else it is that I need to be able to bring the idea into the world rigorously, where then that question, what if, can really be asked by all of us together, where there's some grounding in terms of the materiality, yes, but also all the various other elements that I'm able to create as part of the premise, which include the press release and media coverage, and also often the context of working within a university, for instance, or working in a vernacular that is appropriate and that is going to help to frame and therefore help to elucidate the work.
Right. Well, it's certainly fascinating, and it's everybody who watches our show knows that it's my favorite word on the show because it is truly fascinating and it prompts us to think, which I think is the main purpose. I love the first thought experiment, which just sitting and thinking. It reminds me of this Hannah Arendt film about Hannah Arendt, which just for I don't know, it seems like eternity. She sits and thinks, and they just making it a part of the film. And I think we all can benefit from that. But that brings us to one more question that we're having that I've been asked to read. It's interesting for the audience to find out, how did you start on all this, or even going further, what was your childhood like, unless it's too personal, or how did you come to do this? How did you come to be that way?
I don't think that I deliberately set out to do any of this. I think that I've always been pretty literal minded and relatively naive, and I have tried to find my way in the world and tried to understand the world in very literal ways. So as a child, for instance, finding out about money and people buying and selling things and wanting to really just, I guess, to know what that was, I started to sell things, setting up a stand and selling rocks. And the rocks I was selling were in no way special. They weren't even pet rocks. They were just rocks taken off the ground. And they were for sale for a penny. And there were other rocks that were on the ground that weren't for sale because they were on the ground. And those weren't the rocks I was selling. And so that act of differentiation and commodification, which was certainly not a term that I was using at the time that I'm aware of, as a mode of doing philosophy, which again was not a term that I most likely was using at the time, that all of this simply was my way of thinking, a sort of thinking aloud through objects and through transactions, through interactions, and kind of making for myself some instantiation of something that I saw or heard about that I didn't really understand. And I still don't understand the economy. I'm still trying to figure it out. And I think that selling rocks on the sidewalk probably remains my most interesting work because I'm still trying to figure out what it means.
Did you have important teachers in your early years who inspired your adult work?
I think that all of the teachers who I had were certainly important, either in terms of what I learned from them or what I learned in spite of them. I have never really much cared for formal instruction. I tend to be an autodidact, but I think that being put into a kindergarten or college or any other context is almost a challenge to me to figure out how to take whatever is being put in front of me that I'm meant to know and to find a way in which to understand it. And, and that isn't in any way to denigrate teaching as a profession or the teachers who I have had, but simply to say that my relationship with formal education has always been one of trying to come to my own terms with whatever material is put in front of me. And certainly there have been teachers and professors who have exposed me to ideas and to materials that have been really important as far as my thinking, including in college within the realm of philosophy. I don't see any teacher as being a lodestone, as being the ultimate source, or even a particular source of anything that I've done, which again is not to denigrate them nor to claim that I have any access to any thought that is profound or even necessarily interesting, but simply to observe myself and to be honest about how I tend to take what I observe in the world and to find my own way of working with it. And that the academic context was no different from seeing people buying and selling things and trying to figure out what that meant by setting up a stand on the sidewalk and trying to sell rocks.
I also have a question which is not as much about the book per se, but about your other books. And I know we talked about it a little bit before the show, and correct me if I already asked you this in the beginning, but what about those books in Russian that you have? I'm very intrigued. What are they?
So I found one here and holding it up for the Russian readers in the room, so to speak. I don't even know the Cyrillic alphabet, so I couldn't tell you really what's in here, but I written fiction, and the first novel was published initially here in the US and then got published in translation by Exmo, a Russian publishing house. And then I wrote another novel, and that novel never found a publisher in the English language, still has not. But it was sent around by the agent, and the editor of that first book decided to publish it. And so as a result, it is only in Russian. And I don't know that I even have the manuscript anymore in English. So I have periodically tried to figure out what it was that I wrote using Google Translate to translate the Russian manuscript. And so I have multiple versions right now, which, as when we were talking before we got started, as I said, I think I would like to publish as samizdat editions, and could be even more interesting to do so over time as artificial intelligence gets better in some senses in terms of contending with language, but inevitably as different decisions get made by those who are making the algorithms, and as the work mutates as a result of how AI works and how programmers go about making the assumptions, building the AI based on the assumptions that they choose to bring into it. So the idea that it's a work that never has any authoritative form is really appealing to me, as probably everything that I've said thus far would lead you to suspect. And I hope that perhaps through Globus Books, we can start to get these illegal samizdat editions out into the world.
Well, you know what? I can tell you that could be another thought experiment or one of your projects, because we do have, I should say, we have inherited from the very first owner and founder of Globus Books this ancient printer that is set in the garage and just basically collecting dust, but it's like a handset. You have to put together the letters in Russian, of course, and you can publish a book. It's in Russian, it's Cyrillic, so you want a book in English, but as entity dealing in samizdat and tamizdat collection, and for those listeners who don't know what it is, just very briefly, in the Soviet Union, there was censorship. I mean, it continues in many countries as I speak, but as a result, people would publish books themselves. In fact, I've published books like this myself in the Soviet Union. You just type them on the typewriter and there is a book. Or there was a tamizdat, which means there is that, their publishing, and that was here. So there versus here, Soviet Union versus the USA. So there's a samizdat and tamizdat, and I can see the different way where you can go with your novel, because in theory you had a tamizdat, you had a there publishing with your novel that you now don't know what it is. That is really mind-blowing. I'll try to look for your books, Jonathan. Exmo is a very well-known publishing house, so it shouldn't be a problem. We'll find the book and I'll let you know what it is about.
Excellent. I think that we have a new project. I think that maybe using the Cyrillic alphabet, so transliterating from the English AI translation of the Russian, transliterating back into the Cyrillic alphabet, that might be the best way in which to confound absolutely everybody.
And then we can try to sell it back in Russia. This is fantastic, and this answers someone's question if there are new projects coming out. Well, just kidding, but you never know. Well, back to Alla.
The opening of my introduction to the book, because this is kind of, I think, summarizes the questions that I brought to Jonathan's projects. Is Jonathon Keats an artist? I've never doubted this over my nearly 20 years of working with him on various projects, even while Keats himself has often resisted and resists such a definition, preferring the title of an experimental philosopher. Keats is represented by an art gallery in San Francisco and has had exhibitions and installations in many art museums and galleries internationally. And yet, while his projects are widely covered in the press, both specialized and general interest, art publications shy away from giving him coverage. Keats purposefully operates on the margins of the art world, create a sense of the absurd, provoking viewers and dislodging their expectations. So I think that sort of summarizes what I bring to this project, my sort of thought experiment based on Jonathan's work.
Back to you, Jonathan, then. What would you like to say in the conclusion of this program, or what would you like us to depart with as a final thought?
I think that if this book achieves what I hope it will be to encourage everybody everywhere to become experimental philosophers. I think that we all are as children. I think that that's what we do in terms of pursuing our curiosity without any sense of purpose other than the play and the play of ideas that comes about as a result of that play in the world. I think that society all too often with notions of practicality beats it out of us. And somehow I managed to escape that fate, and I'm grateful for it, and I delight in it every day. And if I can encourage others to do so as well, I can't think of a better outcome for this book and for the projects more generally.
I can't emphasize strongly enough with this sentiment. And I hope that not just this show, but our other Globus shows are encouraging everyone to think more and think differently. So thank you so much for this, Jonathon. I'm certainly looking forward to reading the book, Alla. Thank you for putting it together. It must be brilliant. It has to be, knowing your other work too. And I'm looking forward to exploring more of art by Jonathon Keats and his Russian novels of mystery. And thank you very much, everyone, for spending the afternoon or whatever is the time of the day in your part of the world with Globus. Please subscribe to our channel, support us so we can bring you more art, literature, cultural history shows, and buy the book. It is available from globusbooks.com and will be soon. Thank you very much, everyone.
Well, we really appreciate the opportunity to talk. Thank you, Zarina, for putting it together.
Yes, thank you. Really, it's been a great pleasure. And thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you. The pleasure is all ours. Thank you so much. See you, everyone.